All right, I am still on page 52. I'm not going to lie, I actually did Google concentration to make sure it's spelled with 2 C's and not with an S in the middle. I did it right. Chances are not very good that I would do it right, but I did. You should all be proud of me. The next type of transport that we're going to be talking about is facilitated diffusion. Oh, and before we move on to facilitated diffusion, we should probably talk about what type of molecules do normal diffusion. So in a cell, you have normal diffusion here. This is going to move things inside of the cell. So let's say that you had your, let's say you have your mitochondria over here. Your mitochondria is going to be doing cellular respiration, so it's going to be taking in glucose. Because it's taking in glucose, there's going to be less glucose around it than, say, at the edge of the cell where the glucose came in. So just by normal diffusion, that glucose is going to move from the high concentration where it entered the cell to the mitochondria, which will have a low concentration because it's turning it into water and carbon dioxide. So the diffusion is going to move stuff inside of the cell. It's also going to move things into and out of the cell. So something like oxygen that's really small, that's a small molecule, it can go right through the cell membrane. So if there's more oxygen outside of the cell than in the cell, the oxygen will move into the cell. If there's more carbon dioxide inside the cell, because you've been doing a lot of cellular respiration, then that carbon dioxide is just going to move outside of the cell by diffusion. So diffusion can move things within the cell, or it can move things into and out of the cell. Facilitated diffusion is only happening along the cell membrane. So it's either getting things into or out of the cell. And facilitated diffusion is when you have diffusion, so our molecules are moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. The difference is that it has to happen through a protein, and we call these sometimes transport proteins, but sometimes we also can call them channel proteins. And those are in the cell membrane. So here's what this looks like, and this is really going to test my drawing ability here. But your cell membrane is made up of something called a phospholipid bilayer. And a phospholipid is a phosphate with 2 fatty acid chains. That's the lipid part. And bilayer means that it forms 2 layers. And we're actually going to spend quite a lot of time talking about the cell membrane and this phospholipid bilayer. But for right now, let's just draw. I've got 1/2 of my phospholipid bilayer there, and then I'm going to have my other half of my phospholipid bilayer here. And the way it works is that the phosphates stick towards the edge of the cell membrane, and the middle of the cell membrane gets these fatty acid tails. And that has to do with the fact that the fatty acid tails hate water, and there's a lot of water inside the cell, so they naturally form like this. Now, every now and then, inside of this cell membrane, you get a transport protein. And if I were to look at a side view of a transport protein, it's going to span the area of the cell membrane, and it just makes sort of a passageway so that things can get through the cell membrane. So something like oxygen can just go right between these phospholipids and go right into or out of the cell. Things that are bigger, things like glucose, they can't. And so they're going to need to go through a protein that looks like this. So the protein is stuck in the cell membrane. So there's cell membrane all around it. It's three-dimensional, which I have yet to figure out how to draw. So you're getting a 2D look. Let's finish up having some more phospholipid bilayer on this side. Fatty acid tails of different lengths. It's kind of tangled up here. Alright, so if we want to talk about glucose, we could draw glucose going through here. It turns out that water actually has to go through a transport protein, and it uses its own type of transport protein called an aquaporin, aqua meaning water, and I just like to think that it means aqua pour in, like water pour it into or out of the cell. So let's draw water. So water is an oxygen, and it's got 2 hydrogens attached. So that's going to be what my water molecule looks like. And I'm going to draw a high concentration of water on this side of my cell. This could be the inside of my cell, it could be the outside of my cell. It doesn't really matter. But one side has to have a high concentration, and the other side has to have a low concentration in order for any type of diffusion to work. So I have to have high on one side, low on the other. And this is facilitated diffusion. The word facilitate means to help. So this is diffusion, but it's with help, and it's with the help of a transport protein. So if I've got a lot of my water molecules, let's label it. If I've got a lot of water molecules on this side, and I've only got, say, 2 sad, lonely water molecules on this side, then with the help of this transport protein, the water is going to diffuse from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So let's label this high concentration. Oops, ION. And this over here is going to be a low concentration. So just like with our normal diffusion, it's going from high to low. And if it's diffusion, does it require energy? The answer is no. This is a passive transport. No energy required. Okay. We're going to move on. We've got 2 more. We're going to move on to page number 53. My next type of transport is active transport. And active transport is active, it's not passive. So if passive means it does not use energy, then active means that it does use energy. So the first thing we're going to say here is it uses energy. And it's still going to be moving molecules, so it uses energy to move molecules. But here's the trick. Instead of going from high to low concentration, we are now going from low to high concentration. So uses energy to move molecules from low concentration to high concentration. And this is against the concentration gradient. So instead of being down or with or along, we would say that this is up or against the concentration gradient. So let's kind of add a little note in here. This is against the concentration gradient. I'd been spelling it right the whole time. It is almost 5 o'clock on a Friday, so you guys will have to give me a little bit of a pass here. So this is going against the concentration gradient. So what is important about this is that if my molecules will just naturally move from high to low concentration, then getting them to go the opposite direction is going to take energy. And I like to remember this as it takes no energy for my spray of perfume to spread out along the room, but it would take a whole lot of energy for me to force all of those molecules back into the can. So going against that concentration gradient is going to take me a lot of energy. And the only way that the cell is going to be able to do this is if it does it through a transport protein. So that sentence now reads, active transport uses energy to move molecules from low concentration to high concentration, which is against the concentration gradient, through a transport protein. So I'm going to need to draw my same sort of setup here that I had before. So I have my cell membrane, which is a phospholipid bilayer, and now I'm getting lazy. And then inside of that membrane, spanning the top and the bottom, is my transport protein. Then on the other side, because the protein is through the membrane, to have more of my phospholipid bilayer. Okay, one of the main things that has to be moved through a membrane like this, and it's actually really important in your cells. It happens in your mitochondria, and it makes sort of a proton pump. And what it is if you have a hydrogen that has lost its electron, or it's had its electron stolen from it, then it is simply a positive proton. And your cell often needs to move these positively charged protons from one side of the cell membrane to the other side of the cell membrane. So if I draw two of these here, then that's going to be my low concentration. And I'm going to add a whole bunch of them. And these are just hydrogens, but they just have a proton, no electron. So this is my high concentration side. So if I add energy to this transport protein, then it can take one of these protons and move it from low concentration to high concentration. But it can only do it if you add energy. And we talked oh so briefly about ATP. So what actually happens is ATP comes over here. And the ATP is able to remove the end phosphate, and it gives that energy to the transport protein, which causes the transport protein to change shape, and it can take this proton then and it can move that proton into or out of, depending on which side it is on, of the cell. So in this situation, we have my low concentration here. And I have my high concentration over here. And this time we are moving from low concentration to high concentration. And in order to do this, you must add energy.